from all the way over in India this morning via Zoom. So today our panel is Me Too and Masculinity in Reddit and Beyond, and we've got 4 presenters, including me, and a lot of co-authors here today too. So thanks for joining us. I do also want to just remind everybody that ICA has asked that everybody mask up, please, particularly since we're seeing on Twitter that people already have gotten COVID here. Would be really great not to like freak everybody out this morning, but please do that for me. So this morning we're going to start out with Maggie Foster, who I know from UNC, and then Jessica Ringrose was originally scheduled to present, but she couldn't be here, unfortunately. So Betsy Milne, Tanya Horick, and Caitlin Mendez are going to be presenting that paper, followed by Camden Smith. And I'm going to let everybody introduce their own co-authors because they were not listed in the program, and I don't want to make any mistakes. So without further ado, Maggie Foster.
One second, baby. Sorry.
All good.
The shuffle. Oh, yeah, I can tell you too. That works. Okay. All right. Good morning. I'm also timing myself, so hopefully I won't go too far over here. But thank you so much for being here today. I'm presenting an updated version of this paper, which later became my master's thesis. And I am going to get right into it. So this is a presentation of, this is a critical discourse analysis of Reddit comments responding to the Aziz Ansari Me Too controversy. Can you all hear me? Okay, Slash, I'm shaking heads. Okay. And because the devil is really in the details here, I am going to spend a couple of minutes going into a thicker description of the phenomenon to get the full picture of what's going on. So next slide, please. So you may remember that in January 2018, the feminist startup Babe published an accusation of sexual misconduct from Grace, a pseudonymous 23-year-old woman who accused renowned actor and author and comedian Aziz Ansari, who was 34.
This meeting is being recorded.
Can you click again, please? And this piece included a very detailed timeline of events of this encounter, which took place in September 2017. Basically, they went on a date, met at his apartment, went out to dinner, went back to his apartment, at which point Ansari initiated sexual contact, to which Grace responded with multiple requests to slow down. She backed away physically. At each of these points of rejection, Ansari would briefly back off and then quickly re-escalate his advances. Grace eventually said no explicitly, at which point they got dressed and watched TV. Ansari tried to initiate sexual contact again, at which point Grace stood up to leave instead of saying no once more. Ansari tried to convince her to stay, but eventually conceded to calling her an Uber. And the next day he texted her and she responded saying that she had had a terrible time. He apologized via text. And Babe received significant scrutiny for publishing a large number of details about this case, which I've tried to summarize here, such as the now infamous line about wine. So basically what happened here is that Ansari gave white wine to Grace without consulting her preference and also ordered it for them at the restaurant later that they were eating dinner, where they were eating dinner. This lack of consideration is presented as this like ominous foreshadowing of his later lack of consideration, of asking what contact she wanted to engage in. And people really seized and mocked this detail. The piece seems to present not consulting about wine preference as comparable to not consulting about sexual preference. And people argued that sexual violence is diminished in this process, questioning, what has the world come to if not divining the correct wine preference was tantamount to sexual assault. So next again. So again, this date happens in 2017, but lots of important things happened between September 2017 and when the piece was published on Babe. Most importantly, Toronto Burke's Me Too movement was launched into a global hashtag. And after Aziz Ansari won a Golden Globe wearing a Time's Up pin, Babe approached Grace to go on the record about her experiences, and she agreed. Again, Babe approached Grace. That is the most common misconception that I hear about this case. She did not approach them. So please remember that if that's the only thing you get from this presentation. So she agrees on the condition that she can use a pseudonym. Yeah, you can hit, I think 2 more. Thank you. So she agrees using a pseudonym. And she's really tarred and feathered, one more flick, by more veteran journalists in the field, by reporters who had previously been quite supportive of Me Too. This is a real turning point for the movement. So next, please. So that was the phenomenon that I was interested in. And to think about a theoretical framework, for the sake of time, I'm focusing on epistemic injustice, which is a concept from Fricker in 2007. She argues that there's two kinds of epistemic injustice. One of them is testimonial epistemic injustice, which is focused on individual knowledge agents and their capacity for knowledge. This also relates to communicative injustice, which is not related to an individual's capacity for knowledge, but related to the method of conveying knowledge. So you think about testimonial injustice as women aren't capable of knowing stuff because they're women, and communicative injustice as critiques of women's voices, sometimes literal, sometimes figurative. And then the second kind of hermeneutical epistemic injustice is hermeneutical epistemic injustice, which is related to collective gaps in hermeneutical epistemic resources. So the canonical example here is that prior to the coining of the term sexual harassment by Lynn Farley and colleagues at Cornell, there is no language to describe that violence that so many people had endured for centuries, right? But when that term was introduced into the lexicon, suddenly there was this new collective resource to be able to put our experiences into contact with one another and to understand contextually what had been happening. So at its best, Me Too is a consciousness raising framework that fills gaps in hermeneutical epistemic resources, right? Like its most basic tenet is looking at someone else and saying, yes, you're not alone. Like I too have experienced this violence. And that is adding a hermeneutical resource, a collective interpretive tool. Thank you. So these are all of my research questions. For the sake of time in this presentation, I'm just focusing on my Reddit data and questions 1 and 1A, which are basically asking how Redditors situate Grace's story in relation to Me Too, and what sources of epistemic authority they use to make those claims. So next, please. So like I said, this is a critical discourse analysis, looking at Reddit comments on the Babe piece and news articles that responded to it. So this is a Reddit panel, but very quickly, one of the ways that you can start a Reddit thread is by posting a link to external contact. So I looked at all of the Reddit threads that used a link to the Babe piece as the beginning of a thread. And then I looked at the most popular and most upvoted other articles that addressed the accusation in response, such as this New York Times piece here. And I wound up with the 5 articles on the right over here. I looked at all of the threads that discuss those 5 articles. One more slide, please. And I wound up with 500 parent comments on 63 subreddit threads that involved 32 unique subreddits. So that is all the data there. And one more slide. I found a lot of interesting and really depressing stuff that I mostly will not have time to go into here, but I'm happy to follow up on any of this in the Q&A. And over here, this is an example comment. It is not actually in my final data set, but I think it is the first use of the term Winegate, so I wanted to include it here as an illustration. And overall, Redditors were much faster to critique Grace's behavior than Ansari's, and that's a really key idea here. They were questioning why she would go back to his apartment after dinner. They were questioning why anyone would be naked in your date's apartment for an extended period of time. Folks argued that whatever signals she sent that she was not interested in sexual contact were surely overshadowed by that basic script and participation in that event. They questioned, why she didn't leave faster, why she didn't speak more clearly. There's a lot of victim blaming. Something else that was really interesting. Oh, can you go back? I'm sorry. So something else that was really interesting, this is that testimonials point over here, is that people often use their own positionality as a source of epistemic authority when presenting an opinion on this case. So often people would say things like, I'm a woman and I disapprove of the way that Babe covered this piece. So when you get into those questions of the way that Babe covered something, that's really like a tone policing question. And that gets back to that idea of communicative injustice, right? That Babe is positioned as an unreliable source because of the way that it is relating its information as opposed to any objective interpretation sorry, I really did drink water. Any objective interpretation of its veracity as a source, right? So within that, there's also a lot of resonance about the description Ansari had done wrong, since he eventually let Grace leave. It wasn't like he forced her to stay there beyond when she got up and left. And people often told their own stories of bad dates, arguing that this kind of behavior was normal and therefore was not worth including in Me Too. And those comments were quite frustrating to read because it so easily could have gone the other way. Like, oh, this is very normal and therefore that's bad. And maybe we can do something about that. Instead, folks for the most part were willing to critique Grace's communications deficient, say that she was whining and that because this is normal, it's not a big deal. So now next slide, thank you. Yeah, so just some overall key takeaways, my last minute or so here. I think that this case represents a gap in hermeneutical epistemic resources that Me Too did not fill. This shows the limit of what Me Too had become when it was co-opted by white feminists and largely turned into this star-studded anti-sexual harassment in the workplace campaign, as opposed to the really simple solidarity statement that Tarana Burke had originally envisioned, the beauty and its simplicity of filling that hermeneutical epistemic gap, right? But Redditors were saying the encounter wasn't that bad. I'm sorry, isn't like Hospi or Weinstein. He isn't as violent, which there's a number of racial stereotypes that we can get into in the Q&A with that as well. Redditors also argued that because it's possible to attribute the unpleasantness that Grace experienced to miscommunication, that didn't count as Me Too, but that ignores the fact that miscommunication is often willful, as we see in epistemic injustice. And Grace's cues were perfectly intelligible within an enthusiastic consent paradigm, but Redditors largely rejected that paradigm. And they argued that Grace implicitly consented to Ansari's advances by remaining in his apartment. They also claimed that Me Too was going too far because it had left the distant land of Hollywood, where white feminists had brought it, and had come back into the realm of our everyday behavior, which ironically is much closer to Tarana Burke's original vision once again. So if Ansari's actions had been denounced by Me Too, it could have produced a truly revolutionary consciousness, right? That most people, at least on Reddit, were not willing to face, because it is far more comfortable to leave Me Too in the realm of cases of predation, rather than looking at the times that we ourselves were a little too pushy with our dates, right? So I think, am I about out of time? All right, then I will wrap it up with, so yeah, just explaining how Grace's feelings of violation were actually her fault somehow, tantamount to not speaking up about a wine preference, right? It's the perfect way to avoid examining our own need to hold ourselves accountable for our own misconduct. And I'll leave it there for today. Thank you so much.
So we have Betsy, Tanya, and Caitlin.
Are you happy to do it or not?
I don't.
Yeah, if you're happy to do it, that would be easier. No, it's sorry, it's not that. No, it's not that one.
This one.
That one. Yeah, there we go. Okay, well, I will get started. So yeah, my name's Caitlin Mendez. I'm from Western University. Jessica Ringrose from UCL was supposed to be here, but she had COVID, so she had to cancel. And I've got Tanya Horick from Anglia-Ruskin University and Betsy Milne, who's from UCL. So the paper that we're going to be delivering today is about the moment that Me Too came to British schools during the COVID-19 pandemic. And so you can change the slide, please. And the findings that we're going to share to you come from a funded research project that we did between February 2020 and May 2022. And this aimed to assess the impact of COVID-19 on young people's experiences of online sexual risks and gender harms. And the whole point is to develop resources for young people, parents, and teachers. Next slide, please. So as many of us know, during COVID-19 lockdowns, we had a number of global reports that documented an increase in domestic violence and technology facilitated sexual abuse against girls and women, with as many as 1 in 4 experiencing abuse, bullying, and online harassment. Also in March 2021, we had the disappearance of 33-year-old Sarah Everard from London, and this news event dominated the news. Now, meanwhile, young people, especially teen girls and young women, were steadily uploading their testimonies of sexual harassment and abuse to an Instagram page and accompanying website called Everyone's Invited. And this documented their experiences of rape culture in secondary schools. To date, over 3,000 institutions were outed by the Everyone's Invited website. And more than 54,000 testimonials have been uploaded documenting sexual violence. Okay, great. So the mass mainstream coverage resulted in the Department for Education and the education regulatory body Ofsted. They released a rapid response that documented a shocking normalization of sexual harassment and abuse in schools around Britain. And the review also shows significant gender differences in experiences and understandings of sexual violence, in which girls were reporting much higher levels of sexual harassment and abuse and much more awareness of this harassment than boys. And so this is just the context in which our study was conducted. And so our visits to UK secondary schools began shortly after England's third and final lockdown in May 2021. And there's 2 key findings that we're going to share with you today. The first is that girls were more likely to experience, recognize, and discuss sexual violence, in due part to consciousness raising during lockdown that they experienced via digital technologies like TikTok and Instagram. And second, we're going to argue that we found that some boys deployed Kimmel's notion of defensive masculinity, which denied the scale and scope of the issue, and they adopted this discourse of male victimhood.
Thanks, Katie. Next slide, please. So our study involved survey, focus groups, individual interviews, and creative methodologies in the research schools in which we gave young people social media templates and asked them what they liked and what they didn't like about these platforms. Next slide, please. A key finding is the discrepancy between girls' and boys' responses to the issue of sexual violence. So let's begin with the girls. In the focus group discussions, many girls were aware of Everyone's Invited, Sarah Everard's murder, and the widely reported UN Women UK statistic that 97% of women have experienced sexual harassment. When asked how they came to know about these issues, girls mentioned TikTok and Instagram. Most girls either agreed that their schools deserved to be named on the Everyone's Invited list of schools, colleges, and universities as a site where sexual violence had taken place. And if their schools weren't on the list, they said to us that it probably should be. Next slide, please. Thanks. So Everyone's Invited encouraged critical discussions among female peers about sexual violence. So what we found is that many of the girls would go on the Everyone's Invited website, Instagram page, and they would read these really quite graphic and disturbing testimonies. And then they would use it as a way of opening up a conversation with their peers about sexual violence and experiences that they had had. So through Everyone's Invited, girls reflected on their past experiences and reconceptualized them as problematic forms of gender-based sexual violence. And Betsy is now going to tell you about the boys' responses.
So the second theme that we found that boys had a lack of awareness of sexual violence. So compared to the girls' acute awareness of public discussions on sexual violence, we found that boys in only 2 focus groups were aware of Everyone's Invited, Sarah Everard's murder, and the statistic that 97% of women experienced sexual harassment. So for example, Ronaldo, when asked whether he knew that their school was listed on Everyone's Invited, he responded, "No, not a clue. We haven't ever been told about that." Daphne from the same school stated, "I've never heard of any boys mention Everyone's Invited or talk about sexual harassment of any kind." The few boys that had heard about Everyone's Invited said that they learned about it through school assemblies and for discussions with their peers. And the boys from the all boys school described how they generally described feeling shocked that their school was listed. Next slide. While everyone's invited in Sarah Everard's murder fostered an opportunity for feminist consciousness raising among girls, it also incited denial of societal gender inequalities among the boys in our research. So this aligns with Kimmel's theory of aggrieved entitlement, which describes men's responses to their loss of privilege in the face of increasing gender and racial equality. Girls described how boys commonly deployed various tactics to deny the systemic nature of gender-based sexual violence. This includes some boys viewing sexual violence against girls and women as illegitimate because they had never witnessed it. Next slide. Another tactic was an appeal to male victimhood. So in our focus group, some boys openly discussed how they felt victimized because of their gender. We found this trend to be particularly pervasive in the all boys school, as seen in the quote in the slide. And yeah, we found this trend to be boys discussed feelings being overlooked and having violence against men dismissed. For example, Gary from the all boys school explained that gender is not relevant when discussing sexual violence victimization because it can happen both ways, thus emphasizing boys' potential victimhood over women and girls' lived experience of sexual violence. And yeah, great. And another prominent theme were false rape accusations. So many of the boys strongly believed that and felt aggrieved by the idea that girls and women accuse men of rape. Next slide. Finally, participants from the all boys school offered another frequent rebuttal that not all men are sexual predators. Such claims obscure and naturalize gender hierarchies. So for example, Jeff stated, I feel a lot of guilt because I'm a man, and I feel like I've been blamed for things that I haven't done. It's just because some people have done stuff that every man is being blamed and being punished. Gareth also says, it's such a few amount of people that are rapists, and it creates such a big stigma around boys. We're not responsible for someone else's actions, so we don't have to apologize for it.
So to conclude, the final slide, please. Thank you. Through foregrounding young people's voices, we consider the differing and highly gendered ways that young people understand and respond to sexual violence. While many of the girls' personal stories about sexual harassment and abuse were disturbing, we were also uplifted to see these framed in a politicized way. And while the ferocity of rape myths and the increased normalization of gendered misinformation was often challenging and unsettling, we also left some of these focus groups hopeful. And this is because we witnessed that through providing boys with the space and the time to talk in a safe, non-judgmental environment, they were able to think critically about these issues and demonstrate the ability to shift their understanding and recognize gendered hierarchies. And this final slide that we want to leave you with, these set of images were produced by the young people in our study. So this is sort of a positive note to look on because there's, I think, some quite interesting work. Thank you.
No, it's the one on camera.
Thank you so
Yes,
much
thank
for
you.
running time for
Thank
us.
you.
You don't even want to know what would have happened if I had to do it. Yeah.
Hi, everyone. I'm Camden Smith. I'm here with Cindy Brammer. Our third author, Robert Peasley, couldn't make it, unfortunately. We are presenting on this paper. I swear some of these guys don't even like women. This project was made possible by the Harris Institute for Hispanic and International Communication at Texas Tech University. Okay, so let's get started. Yes, perfect. So today we're going to be talking about the app OnlyFans, which is essentially an app where users can pay a subscription-based fee to access content from influencers. This app was created for influencers of all kinds, so YouTubers, Instagram people, and so on. But it quickly became a place where sex workers could produce pornography or explicit content at their own home, at their own, being their own producers or distributors. So with this app, it's really interesting because the influencers take quite a big portion of their revenue. They're also able to set, to some degree, there is a few caps, the prices for their content. And we're really seeing what makes this app really interesting is that it facilitates a highly interpersonal and highly intimate relationship between users and content creators. Here we can see when we look on the app, influencers are able to, or users are able to pay higher fees to get highly personalized content from influencers. So in the explicit sector, this could be anything from like foot pics to full nudity, right? So what we're seeing is influencers really have the control to produce the content they want to be producing. Okay. Okay, so for this study, we took a sample of 100 Reddit threads posted on the subreddit r OnlyFans Advice. I will show you guys what this thread looks like here in a second, but I just wanted to briefly give an overview. So within the subreddit, you have threads, and these threads are categorized by what Reddit calls as flares. I believe the moderators are the ones that categorize this content. So we had 7 flares among all the posts. And the flares were advice, where influencers were giving each other advice. Some were just discussions, some didn't have a flare, some were talking about scams that were going on the platform. Subscribers would mean like the conversations that were going on between influencer and subscriber, tips, how to get more money, and vent. So we took these 100 Reddit threads and we used MaxQDA to perform a thematic analysis to flesh out the themes. But before I get there, I wanted to just show you guys what these Reddit posts would look like if you've not been on Reddit. So to the right, this is a brief description of the subreddit r OnlyFans Advice. I want to mention here that we did get permission from the moderators on this post to analyze the data, as long as we didn't post on the thread, as we are not a part of this subreddit. So above you can see the post, the initial post. I put a star next to the flare and then the title in the subreddit. The next slide, there you go, would be the comments to that thread. And you can see that even on the comments, people can upvote or downvote, and that positions where the comments or the thread itself is positioned on. So with more upvotes, it'd be placed closer to the top. Okay, so I wanted to return back to the literature. While we're talking about sex work, I really wanted to return back to these overarching discussions about sex work in general, specifically the pornography industry. So before OnlyFans hit the scene, there was really 2 overarching perspectives or conversations surrounding sex work. So this perspective would be the exploitation perspective, in which the sex workers or people participating in pornography would be seen as objectified. Here, the scholars really touch on the unequal wealth distribution among producers and directors versus the actors that are performing. You also, since pornography is directed to a largely male audience, a lot of scholars have brought up this point of the male gaze, as well as the social and systemic male dominance that occurs in the pornography industry especially. But on the other hand, we have a labor-centered approach. So these conversations really center around the embodiment and lived experiences of sex workers. So sex workers as being in control of their own body, having agency to choose that labor, and control over their own industry, right? So I thought this was a really interesting perspective reading through Foucault, this idea of returning to the 17th century perspective in which sex was seen as a mere part of life versus the explicit or the erotic. So with this, like I said, it centers sex workers as having agency in labor or agency and control. Here we can talk about the legitimization and decriminalization of sex workers, as well as unionization, labor rights, retirement, so on and so on. Okay, so this is a lot, right, in the literature, and it's been going on for quite a while. But like I said, we have this new platform in which sex workers are able to create their own content at their own prices. So we raised the question of whether or not this platform has the potential to, at the very least, disrupt some aspects of the traditionally seen as objective pornography industry. With this, we adopted what Weitzer calls the polymorphous paradigm, which essentially we're positioning OnlyFans as an app that is between the spectrum of the exploitation perspective and the labor-centered perspective, in which there has been instances where OnlyFans has turned their back on sex workers at some point, threatening to kick them off the platform. That obviously didn't end well when they realized near 90% of the workers on OnlyFans were sex workers, right? So obviously there is still questions of control, but like I said, we're still seeing some empowerment that's happening on this app. So we position that it's somewhere in between. Taking all of this together, we had 2 research questions for this project. One would be what evidence is available in these discussions that users are experiencing empowerment, disempowerment, or a combination of both with regard to their role as producers of content. Sorry, my mask is falling down. What challenges are users discussing among themselves with regard to the OnlyFans platform, usability, such as technical issues, etc., the demands of OnlyFans consumers, or the demands of non-human actors such as algorithms/AI.
Perfect. And I have the honor of telling you about our preliminary results. So the first theme that we found was that of advertising, which is the idea that OnlyFans creators have the opportunity to advertise for their own content because they created it and priced it and kind of planned it all out, so they have to be the ones to promote it. But they do have some trouble, right? It's easy to go on apps like TikTok and promote, but they did say you are going to get banned, right? Especially if your content is explicit, so they have to do some workarounds. There's some really interesting loopholes in language that makes that possible. And then they also feel that they are shadow banned. So if they get banned on one app or they get banned on one account, create a new one, they're also not able to get that one up and running. That could be an IP address situation or previous cookies and data that's collected like that. Next, please. We also had subscriber intimacy, where creators were talking about their connection to their subscribers, which was a surprise to us. As you'll see at the very bottom, our quote that was in our title, "I swear some of these guys don't even like women. They're so mean for no reason. It's not my fault you don't like women." And you know, these are verbatim, these are their words, their punctuation, their spelling, exactly as they meant it. And you can see there's an exclamation mark there, right? We're feeling really strongly about that. But there were actually more instances like the first 2 where they said, "I'm really connected to my subscriber." The first one said the fan had passed away. The family contacted them because they've been in such frequent contact with this creator. They're worried about it being a scam, right? So that's really unique to this platform. And then also in the middle, creating niche content, like this creator who said they had been receiving a request to eat a bucket of fried chicken and wipe the grease on their body, which is really niche, right? And then this subscriber that requested it disappeared. So now they have to kind of navigate these really specific, unique requests. What do you do with your content? Support is a really big issue with the platform, as we all know, because we've been trying to do everything online for 2 years now. It can get really tricky when there are problems, and they've been having issues with things like payment, having access to certain tools within the app, having users unable to do things like or share or request content, and then not being able to price their content the way they want to in terms of a cap. Right, so the platform saying you can't charge more than this amount. Thanks. And then they're seeking advice where they're asking about different performative acts, right? So how do I do something I've never done before? What's the best way to market this? And they give a lot of advice to each other about that and about what's most successful on the platform. So for example, you see here at the bottom, what kinds of services are you offering? There's something called the girlfriend experience. So there's lots of different niche opportunities there. We're looking at more additional themes. Analysis is still ongoing. We have over 125,000 posts that were scraped from Reddit. So we're quickly kind of moving through the sample to make sure we didn't miss anything important. But we are seeing things like questions about taxes. What do you do when you're now your own small business? Seeking community with others. Do I even refer to myself as a sex worker, or do I say I'm doing something else? Am I an influencer? That kind of question comes up a lot. And then limitations such as the inability to follow up with subreddit authors for further clarification. And then for our future research, we're going to continue looking at those threads and their comments and continue to do further interpretations on both ends of that polymorphous paradigm. We're also excited to look into algorithms and demographics and how the functionality of the app impacts this as well. Thank you all so much.
I'm loving these tag teamed presentations. That's Feminist Scholarship Division. All right, so I introduced myself already. I'm Meredith Creedon. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm going to be talking to you today about a community of men called involuntary celibates. I'm going to just do the intro while Melissa's getting the PowerPoint or the keynote working. I'm hoping that it will work. And I do want to provide a quick trigger warning that there are some slides at the end that have direct verbiage from incels.is forum that is pretty racist and misogynist. That probably will be not a surprise to anyone in this room, but I did want to just give a trigger warning on that. And I also want to state up front that when I'm talking about the themes later in the presentation, I'm describing the frames that the incels themselves use. I do not agree with what they are saying, so please do not take it that way, or take pictures and tweet and be like, she said, because that's not what I mean. I want to say it up front. I approached this study from a feminist media studies perspective. I'm not really diving into the theoretical framework today in lieu of time, but I do also just want to quickly say that for those who aren't familiar with incels, the term was actually coined by a queer woman in the 1990s, and she created a website where she talked about being lonely, trying to date, navigating gender norms, and her goal, she said, was to create an inclusive community for everybody. Unfortunately, that has been co-opted by what many consider to be a group of primarily young, white, Western guys, that's inaccurate, by the way, based on my dissertation work. But that's kind of the stereotype of incels that we see often in the media and also in some research. So on that note, I could talk about some of this stuff without slides. I'm hoping we can get it going in time for like the network map, but we'll see what happens. So I also do want to just kind of preface this by saying that incels are not a homogenous group, right? On one end of the spectrum, there are really just lonely people longing for companionship. There are women, there are LGBTQ plus folks, right? On the other end are these potential and sometimes bona fide mass killers, right? Who are remembered in the incel community as, martyred saints and heroes often. So that's problematic. I'm a fellow with the Institute for Research on Male Supremacism as well. We call that group misogynist incels, and that's the group that I'm talking about today, not the lonely folks on the other end. So we see misogynist incels as essentially a male supremacist movement, right? They target and kill women and bystanders who get in their way. Right? And because they believe that they're unable to find sexual or romantic partners due to, and this is a quote, naturally determined factors out of their control, right? So more than 50 people have been murdered by black-pilled misogynist incels in mass violence incidents in just the last few years. So it's really important we understand what they're saying, where they're saying it, how they're connected to other groups and movements in order to challenge their narratives and prevent the recruitment, radicalization, and mobilization of men into a movement most known for its acts of gendered violence. So as I mentioned, this is one part of my dissertation research. So what I'm talking about today is a thematic mapping of discourse on incels.is, formerly incels.co, formerly incels.me. They just keep picking up and moving it when they get when their hosts deplatform them. So this part of the project talks about what it is they're saying and where they're saying it on incels.is. So the unique corpus was directly extracted from incels.is. It contains more than 6 million comments from the publicly available threads on the forum between its inception in November 2017, and that's when Reddit removed the incels sub, right? So they created their own, and the date of data acquisition, which was in April 2021. So to look at the discursive self-representation on the forum, I conducted a mixed methods examination using the analysis of topic model networks, or ANTMAN method, which is by Walter and Ophir. And it's essentially an inductive computational approach to frame analysis that includes 3 steps to thematically map data, and that is topic modeling, network analysis, and community detection. To this, I also added critical discourse analysis because I'm a qualitative scholar traditionally who learned computational work, so I do a lot of mixed methods work. And this is where I really hope we can get the keynote going.
I'm so sorry, I don't think it's working.
Well,
Shut it, download it. Yeah.
yeah, I mean, I airdropped it to her.
No, in the keynote. Address key signature. Oh.
Sorry, everybody. I can do it without it, but everybody's gonna be like, what are you talking about?
Oh, great.
All right, there we go.
Sorry.
It's okay. Well, again, thank you for your. I can certainly wing it, but because of the network graph and stuff, it'd be helpful if you could see it. And you can go to the, yeah, we can go one more back. Sorry, go back just one. Okay, so this is why I wanted a visual of it. I know it's somewhat small, but what you see on the slide is the 100 topics that emerged from the topic modeling of incels.is, as well as a sampling of some of the top words per topic, which I condensed for space. Otherwise, it would be so tiny that you wouldn't be able to see it at all. The table is grouped and color coded by community cluster, and you're going to be seeing that again on the next slide, which will be more legible. And next slide. So this is the global network map. And I do want to also just point out really briefly that what you saw on that page before, for those who aren't familiar with computational methods, the LDA topic model doesn't provide names or labels. It's up to the researcher to do the analysis and decide based on top words, top text, in this case, comments on incels.is, what the topic actually means. And the topic is statistically representative, the most statistically representative comments per topic. Okay, so these are what I read through and labeled the topics. And you'll notice the node names are the same as the topic names we saw on the previous slide. So in the ANTMAN method, the nodes are frame elements. And this is an undirected but weighted network. It's got 100 topics and 1,940 connections between them. Those are the lines in between. They're grouped into 4 clusters. The clusters that are color coded represent the frames. So in blue is the physical appearance frame. And this focuses on traits that cause men to be labeled or to self-identify as an incel. And this is generally based on hierarchical attractiveness scale, where Chads and Stacys are at the top in their lingo. Normies are in the middle and incels are on the bottom. In all cases in this forum, excuse me, being white ranks higher, right? They're fond of saying just be white. So that's apparently more attractive to them. And in this view, women can't be incels because they're both genetically and socially programmed to seek higher status men on the attractiveness scale, and they have no problem getting them, doesn't matter, right? So that's, and remember, these are black-pilled incels. So in purple is the theory and identity frame. Here we see users cherry picking science or drawing on pseudoscience often to support a lot of the topics that we see in the physical appearance frame, right? And so they're constructing this incel identity in the forum. However, users also discuss non-appearance related elements they see as common to incels, excuse me, two of which are very common is being autistic. I think in many cases, and we see this in the media too, and media coverage of them, I think in many cases, it's just a slang term or a self-diagnosis. It's really problematic in a lot of ways that I don't have time to get into today. And then also childhood bullying. So they often blame like external factors, but again, out of their control. We also see quite a lot of theorizing about the social order, right? So they're negotiating a lot of the core beliefs of the sort of misogynist incel philosophy and ideology. Most of it is not original. It's spilled over from other misogynist, racist, anti-Semitic, heteronormative beliefs and conspiracies, which I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A. The lifestyle frame in green describes how they spend their time, right? So this is like how, and also how they wish they could spend it. So they talk a lot about video games, gaming, masturbation, fapping, entertainment media, porn a lot, food and drink, like what they had for lunch, and just very banal sort of stuff like that too. They also discuss pretty frequently either their attempts at like pickup artistry or trying to have sex, suicide attempts, how to kill yourself, and murder. So this is really kind of a relational maintenance frame that holds the community together. Right. And then finally, the online community frame is in orange, is focused really on gatekeeping the community and yet simultaneously promoting both the community and themselves. So, and they also share a lot of materials they find interesting. So this is sometimes just memes that cross over from the far right, oftentimes media content, and also academic articles. They share a lot of academic articles. This frame is really a function, I think, of performing inceldom, kind of following Finstermacher and West doing gender, looking at like a doing incel kind of thing, because they've got to conform to forum norms to be afforded membership, right, within this community. And so, if we think of through like just doing gender and doing incel, then they're discursively performing incel traits. They're demonstrating an understanding of the incel lifestyle. They're illustrating a comprehensive grasp of the theory and identity frame, right, of the group. When they fail to successfully combine these things, they're unaccountable to the collective, right? And therefore they end up being subject to pretty extensive like ridicule and mockery. They're not nice to each other in this forum either. So he's failed to do incel in a normative way by community standards. So next slide, thank you. So just a couple of takeaways in addition to doing incel. I want to say first and foremost, this study provides evidence and support that both supports and expands on earlier critical feminist findings related to incels, much of which has been wrongly discounted by those not in the kind of feminist scholarship area as, we've all heard it before, not rigorous, not empirical. So this provides a little bit of empirical evidence for them. Additionally, while this forum is clearly an affectively charged networked fraternity of men who feel excluded from the public sphere, and they've really kind of created their own counter public space here. And it's obviously, as others have pointed out, characterized by a toxic gamer culture, a profound sense of victimization. It's also wildly inaccurate to say that this space is only characterized by those things. And I think that's really important if we're going to kind of better understand why these men continue to return to a place online where they are so mean to each other, right? And everyone else. There'd be little incentive for people who crave social connection and self-esteem to come to these places if that wasn't the case. And also, I just want to quickly point out, and then I'm going to wrap it up, that users draw extensively from the mainstream media, academic publications, government websites to support their beliefs and legitimate their brand of exclusionary identity politics. And I refer to this in the dissertation as tactical engagement, and that's something I'm kind of trying to work through theoretically right now. And they're also really engaging in Jenkins' tactics of participatory culture, right? We see collaborative problem solving, we see them create affiliations, we see informal but hierarchical mentoring, which is also facilitated via the platform affordances of incels.is, where the longer somebody's on the site, their username changes color, right? So there's like markers of, who's the most incel, I guess, on the forum. And I think I'm going to leave it there for time so we can get to the Q&A. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So if the presenters want to come sit up here, and then we can maybe turn a couple of the chairs around. I don't think they're attached for Q&A. I'm going to stand so I can kind of. so I can kind of moderate, so I can see hands and stuff. So who's got questions? Nobody? Okay.
Or comments?
I have comments. So shut up.
Well, my name's Maggie. And Maggie, I really enjoyed the presentation. And I know you and I in the past have had a conversation about sort of like how race plays into the Aziza Ansari case. And I think that Grace's background is not disclosed, but it's
Correct.
that she's white. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more, either our conversations or any insights we have on race in the context of.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for asking that question, because I was really sad to not be able to make that in the 10 minutes. So also, yeah, apologies. I definitely did not practice my presentation with my mask, so I'm doing my best here. Yeah, so as you said, Grace's racial identity is not disclosed in the initial babe.net piece. She was later doxxed, but I chose to not review her information. So we don't know actually what race or ethnicity she is, although the primary assumption is that she is white. And I will say that the strongest evidence I've heard for that conjecture is that Aziz Ansari mainly dates white women, right? So that is not too difficult of a cognitive leap to make. And then in terms of the racial stereotypes that played into the way that Redditors talked about Aziz Ansari, I think, so as you know very well, there's kind of this dual stereotype around Asian American masculinities of both being this kind of latent sexual threatening white women, which you see a lot in post 9/11 discourse in particular. But then there's also the stereotype speaking of incels of the kind of effeminate masculinity, or otherwise somehow needing white American virility to teach Asian American men how to be manly in some sense. And that latter sense of kind of more effeminate masculinity is what I saw more in the Reddit comments about Aziz Ansari. And that was also connected to his brand of comedy, right? Which was very much, he branded himself as being like the one nice guy who like listens to women and understands what it is that they're saying. And so on the feminist side of things, that was the hypocrisy that Grace was pointing out and that Babe was pointing out. But for a lot of the kind of anti-feminists or MRAs on Reddit who were talking about this, they just kind of took that as further evidence of Ansari's emasculation and self-emasculation, which was often couched in racist terms. To answer your question.
I also had a question on the Ansari issue. So did you find any of the feminist backlash against all the Reddit comments? Because I did interviews with women after that happened, and college age women that I was interviewing were very much in sympathy with the Babe article. And I just wondered where that might have popped up on social media that you might have identified, because I was really surprised by how sympathetic they were to the account in Babe, and they had kind of come back to everything that all of those articles that you listed, they were widely read, you know, and they were just really disagreed.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, and thank you. And I will say that I think part of the reason why I didn't get as many sympathizers with Grace in my sample was because of the method of sampling. So the looking at Reddit and looking at Reddit comments that responded to a specific news article were often, or I just saw folks really agreeing with the writers of the articles, which were usually unsympathetic to Grace. The places that I didn't talk about in this presentation, but that I saw in my thesis where people were more likely to be sympathetic were actually on comments on the news sites that those articles were posted to. So some of the New York Times comments were much more likely to disagree with Bari Weiss and call her out for disparaging young feminists and millennials and Gen Z feminists, because there is a very big age gap, as you're saying, and a generational gap in feminism here. In terms of on Reddit, the only place where I really saw people pushing back against that dominant framework of Grace needs to shut up, she's just whining, etc. The only place where I really saw that was in response to Caitlin Flanagan's very incendiary and factually inaccurate Atlantic article, where people were kind of making fun of her for like one of the Redditors called it like old person shouts at cloud kind of fair. And so there was kind of that sense of like, oh, that she's just out of touch. She doesn't really know what's going on. And that was the main place where people were pushing back more so than expressing direct and explicit sympathy with Grace. There were exceptions, but that wasn't the general trend that I saw.
Hi, first of all, I just want to say that this was such a good panel. Like all the papers were really interesting. I feel like they all come together really well. And I just wanted to thank you all for doing kind of what you do with it. So I have a question that hopefully ties a couple of these papers together. Caitlin, in your presentation, it really struck me how the theme number 3, like this really sets up the conditions for the kinds of discourses we see in incels forums. Not to say that these boys will end up becoming incels, but just that this kind of sense of victimhood we see throughout far right forums, throughout men's rights forums. And it was nice to see some hopeful uplift at the end of your presentation. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that, because I was so struck by the disparity and the sophistication of the girls' feminist frame and their understanding. Also, I love that they were radicalized on TikTok. That's rules. But and the boys just been like, I have no idea. Like that was incredibly striking to me. Like, don't they talk to each other?
I think that was really striking in the research, certainly. Was
Yeah,
like
definitely.
the gender disparity. But I think you're right, because so we actually created these workshops. We went in and we taught them about sexual violence. And then we created another workshop called Activating for Change. And then we actually did focus groups with the young people to find out what they thought about the workshops. And it was in those kind of discussions that you start to see, if you actually kind of give them space to think and stop and think about these issues, you can actually start to see that their discourses and their consciousness starts to change. So it wasn't for everybody. And certainly, and I'm kind of looking to Tanya and Betsy to jump in. It wasn't everybody, but there were some.
I also think it was particularly the age group that we were working with. I think that the hope stems from them actually still trying to make sense of what their role is in this like larger picture. And so I think I definitely spoke to some teenage boys who were trying to empathize for women and girls, but then also have this defensiveness. But they would have moments like, well, I kind of understand why like girls are feeling more scared or more like worried about being a victim, but then at the same time it's like, but a lot of them are making false rape accusations. So they're kind of this back and forth, but it wasn't just all the kind of like defensive or denial reaction.
But it was really striking how gendered it was, like in terms of the girls talking to each other, but the girls and boys never speaking to each other about these things. It was so striking. Yeah.
Yeah, we do make a big case for like why we need better relationship and sex education, and then this can play such an important part in actually shifting consciousness and raising awareness.
Like a lot of the young people we talk to have been in lockdown. They haven't had sex education of any form for at least 2 years, and they're desperate to talk to us about it, especially the girls.
I have a question again for you three. I'm curious if you saw any like gender non-conformity or gender non-binary identities. I know that mainly you're focusing on the boys, the girls, and that totally makes sense within kind of our society and how these things work. But I'm curious if you saw any of that in the sample.
So I think
It's a very good question.
Yeah, it is a great question. I think we actually only had one participant who was non-binary. So
In our focus group. We did a
yeah.
survey as well,
Yeah.
and we had a higher proportion of trans and non-binary people there. And we certainly saw difference. So we were asking, this is like our huge study that we've done. So sorry, we're just kind of like presenting like a really small element. But we certainly saw like there are different experiences of gendered abuse and violence. It was also different depending on their sexuality. So we have kind of done like these cross tabulations. But in terms of specifically how they articulated it. Yeah, we only had one in person, and then I don't think there was anything significant about how.
I don't think it was like the in-person format that you did, like to come out in person or come up to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But within, it was actually, we were kind of really struck within the lecture survey, there were like maybe a higher proportion of people who, you know, kind of, yeah, gender non-conforming, and also, you know, the sexual diversity was also, I think it was about a quarter of young people didn't identify as heterosexual, so they identified somewhere kind of on asexual, bisexual, pansexual, questioning, not sure, you know, all of these different things. So there's still a lot more to do.
Meredith, I wanted to ask you a very particular question.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm looking at your list on the online community subsection of things that you highlighted, and down here, there are soy larpers, and I'm curious about soy cup orbiters and soy larpers.
Yeah.
And how are they, I mean, I'm not really interested in gaming as a gaming framework, so soy larpers in particular, I'm interested in what the context is for that.
Yes, that's a great question, and it is particular, but yeah, it's also kind of interesting, right?
It's very deep into the.
Yeah, no, it's okay, it's
weeds,
okay. So
yeah.
incels have like their own language that it's hard to navigate if you don't kind of understand it. So this is just one example of like lots of things that you have to like kind of figure out and dig through. So soy is a reference to like soy boys, right? Cuck is an old term for men, usually white men, who are emasculated by their wives who have sex with non-white men, right? So it's just and then the LARPers, for those who don't know the live action role play, it's essentially the incels way of saying these people don't belong in our space. Like they're faking being incel being here, and so they don't belong. So they're trying to like out. It's just sort of like with the far right and like white supremacist groups as well. They're very concerned about being infiltrated by others. And so this is a term they use for people they think are on the forum that have infiltrated their space. Ironically, on Incels.is is an open forum, just like the white nationalist forum, Stormfront, and many others, right? They're open. And they do have some private spaces in them. You have to be a member, but they're still, which to me is just the weirdest thing that we have an open forum that anybody can be on, but we're also very concerned about infiltrators and like our privacy. It's just a very strange like cognitive dissonance for me.
Did they mention anything about NPCs?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. They talk a lot about gaming.
Yeah, well, I mean, because I know that that's also a term that's often used. So like.
Yeah, they talk. There's a lot of gaming lingo that they use, and in fact, they talk about like when they get plastic surgery, they talk about that as like leveling up, right? They talk about or like if they go to the gym and get all swole or whatever, that's a form of leveling up. They also talk about like how Chads and Stacy's are playing life on easy mode, and like Incels is like super death mode. So there's a lot of like gaming lingo that's used.
Thank you.
No, thank you for the question.
So wait, so are soy LARPers, are they soy boys who are LARPing as incels? Or
Yes.
are they LARPing as soy boys?
No, they're LARPing as soy boys.
Wait,
And on the incel forum. It's like a very weird.
wait, they're pretending to be soy boys or they're pretending to be incels?
They're pretending to be incels. Sorry.
Okay, now I understand.
Yeah, they're pretending to be incels. Sorry, I got confused there for a second. Any other questions? Yeah.
Well, I had a question for the Smith and Brammer group. I thought that was a really fascinating presentation, and it just had a lot of connections maybe to other work being done on the way online communities are changing the performance of sexuality. I just wondered if you've drawn those connections or speak to that, because I loved that girlfriend experience.
Yeah, I think that's what's so unique about OnlyFans, right? So the pornography industry is really subject to like the genres, right? And those genres are pretty sexist and racist and stereotypical and harmful in many ways. Whereas by positioning the sex workers as the directors and producers and distributors, they're able to communicate like sexuality in a different way. And this also opens up opportunities for like new genres or maybe like more like feminist porn, more explicit, but you know, like feminist porn is usually like made by women for women type thing, you know. And I also think, yeah, there's this idea of like an intimate relationship, which we've discussed, like future studies, maybe even looking at like, could that change some of the conversations about sex workers in general? Does that humanize them? Or are they still like a fantasy? So yeah, I think it's really interesting. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's really cool. I urge you guys to look into it because the different niches and the different directions, and we're seeing all genders, all sexualities, and that's what really makes this pretty interesting and maybe less secretive, you know, because it's becoming more and more popular to be an OnlyFans model, right? In the mainstream. Yeah, I don't know if you have anything to add there.
Well, I think the categories portion is really important, right? Because they get to label their own content and also choose how they market themselves. Some of them don't even call themselves sex workers, right? There's discussion of like being a surrogate partner or like providing that girlfriend experience that's totally, or even a friendship experience that's totally platonic, right? Just saying that you have somebody you can talk to. Yeah, you paid $5, but I'll give you an hour of my time, right? Which could be kind of dicey, kind of problematic in some instances. But if somebody really needed access to someone who would listen, maybe there's something there, especially when they're having difficulty maybe finding mental health resources or something like that. And I saw your hand go up.
I had a question for you that I know so you're focused on like the more extreme styles, but I was wondering whether you kind of for age at all and whether teenage boys, like how that kind of fits in, if it was focused on at least mostly adult men that you're researching.
Yeah, so I mean, it's impossible to know for sure on incels.is because it's anonymous, right? What I will say is that there are debates on the forum from between users who are clearly older and younger on the scale or on the spectrum, because you know some users would be like, a 16-year-old can't possibly be an incel. Like, you're a teenager, teenagers are inherently awkward. Lots of teenagers don't have sex, right? Like that you can, and then they'll come back and be like, but it's different for me, you know? So there's clearly a very wide age range happening here. And then some people talk about owning their own house, you know, or like having a job in an office, or having been to college already. While others are, you know, well, I still live with my parents, I just play video games all day. Like so there is that stereotypical, like, I'm in my parents' basement gaming, you know, but then there's a huge range of other people based on their described experiences. And there's probably 20 countries represented on the forum. They mostly speak in English, but not exclusively.
Hi, thank you for your presentations. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit more on the creative workshops or methodology and what results came out, because it was very interesting, the slides. So
Yeah, so with the COVID study, we gave them these social media templates at the start, and we encouraged them, they could write down words or they could do drawings. We left that totally open to them. We gave them the supplies, what they liked and what they didn't like about a platform of their choice. And then with the second study that we're doing, we also had creative aspects to that, didn't we? So we used a range of things like Post-it notes. And what else was in the workshop? It was
So the workshops are around sexual violence prevention and also becoming an active bystander. And then we had creative activities, which the ones that were shown on the slide came from those where they could create their own activist campaign where they would draw on the templates. And so the ones that you saw were like these drawings and Greek culture came from those. And Yeah.
That's it, yeah. Yeah, so we're just doing the coding of all of that now, and it is quite fascinating to see the different themes that emerge, and there's some brilliant art.
Yeah, I think the reason we used it is because we understood that especially in these like group contexts, not everyone would feel comfortable or safe speaking out. So we also recognize like we didn't choose the composition of the groups. So you could be in a group with someone who is actually sexually harassed or committed sexual violence against you. And so that may not inherently be a safe space. So it was a different way. It was, to express and to kind of share with us some of the things that they were experiencing in their schools, issues that they really cared about in their schools. And we're hoping to really be able to kind of prioritize and privilege their voices, because I think that's a key thing is that young people's voices, all these adults are, they're making all the decisions, but maybe they don't necessarily know the realities of what young people are experiencing. So it's just another way of capturing their voices and their experiences and what they want to see change. Because I think that was really important for us to not just go in and be like, oh, when that, someone did this to you, that's sexual violence. You've been, you've experienced sexual violence, and then them feeling like, oh crap, like, well, what do I do about it? So it was also trying to give them tools to say, there are small things that you can do that to change.
Any other questions? We have just a couple of minutes left.
I have a question for you, Meredith.
Yeah.
So you're,
I was thinking I was going to take chair's privilege and ask a question of them, but go ahead.
so you're talking about I'm not super familiar with incels, and you were mentioning how there's this kind of stereotype of like, oh, I live in my parents' basement or whatever. I guess I would be really curious to hear you talk about like, do incels talk about other women apart from the ones that they see as like women to have sex with, or like women who aren't having sex with them? So I'm thinking especially about like their mothers or like their grandmothers, whoever they live with, and like, does that come up at all, or do they just like not exist?
No, I mean, that's a great question. Thank you, first of all. They do talk about family. A lot of times when they talk about family, it's this very like nostalgic kind of wish for the past, and like because a lot of them will say on the forum they were really happy up until I turned this age. It's usually around puberty, because that's when like they kind of lost a connection with their family. Their peers got really mean, like, so there's this definite like nostalgic kind of, which we see in a lot of supremacist groups. It's not all, it's like a nostalgia for the past, often an imagined past in many groups, right? That we study. But yeah, so they do talk about other women in their lives, usually in that nostalgic, wistful, like, I wish it was like it was then. Sometimes we see them talk about how much they hate their family, and like their family doesn't understand their plight, or like their family wants them to go get a job and they just want to lay down and rot, is what they call it. But you said LDAR, they write it all like that a lot. Or they just want to like play video games or watch porn or do whatever they want to do, but they don't want to go get a job. But that's not universal either. I mean, there are a lot of debates in the forum about like what it means to be an incel and who can be an incel, and if you have a job, are you really an incel, which seems completely unrelated, right? But to many of them, it is not. Yeah. And I just wanted to mention, I don't want to keep everybody late, and I'm actually chairing a panel at 9:30, so I've got to run to the other building. I just wanted to ask you guys, were the focus groups that you conducted were mixed, boys and girls?
Actually, it's ended up being, there's only one mix.
Yeah,
group. So
mainly
it was-
girls.
Yeah, and that was just like self-selecting.
Okay.
They tended to come with their friendship
But
groups.
yeah.
Okay, I was just wondering, some of the quotes you had from the boys were things that I would have imagined that boys may not have wanted to say in front of girls.
Yeah.
And it also struck me that many of them are very like men's rights activisty.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and so it just struck me how
Yeah.
prevalent and popular those have been, because I doubt whether those boys even know.
That's
where they come
why we
from.
wanted to do the study in the first place, is we wanted to see how the MRA discourses were filtering down. And when we first started like thinking about this study years ago, it was like we were noticing like Chads and Stacy's, or like other language that you're familiar with, where like young people are saying that to us. Where are they getting this from, and like how is it that consciousness is just becoming popular
I see it in my own son, honestly. I have to snap at him. Sometimes you like, don't use that word. That is a militarized like word. Don't use it.
One thing I will add is that I think the most extreme quotes came from the all boys school. So they definitely had like another level of, and like most likely because they didn't have kind of peers to maybe question their the language that they're using. And so they were quite confident in these statements that they were making. That were very traumatic.
It's also a very privileged school, which is also really interesting to think about.
Yeah.
Class.
Yeah, thank you. It just kind of struck me, so I was curious about that. And on that note, I think it is 9:15. So I will thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you our presenters. Thank you so much, Melissa. I really appreciate your help. It's okay. It's okay. I really didn't need anything but that camera, and even that wouldn't have been a big deal. I could have just kind of, but thank you so much for everything.
It's been recorded in our university, like.
It's okay. Thank you again. I really appreciate it. I'm sorry to run off, but I gotta be on the third floor of the other building in 15 minutes.